My name is Victor. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my career I've worked in business development, one of those roles that exists somewhere between strategy and patience. The kind of job where success rarely happens in dramatic moments, but in quiet, consistent effort over time. If you asked most of my co-workers what I was like back then, they'd probably describe me with words like reliable, calm, or maybe even a little too quiet. I wasn't the loudest person in meetings. I didn't interrupt people to make my points heard. I didn't compete for attention, and because of that, people often underestimated me. Not maliciously, at least not at first. It's just that in many workplaces, visibility gets mistaken for value. The people who speak the most often appear the most important. The people who move quietly in the background tend to disappear in people's mental picture of how things work. I learned early in my career that being underestimated has a strange side effect. People stop noticing what you're actually doing. For years, that worked in my favor. I built relationships slowly. I paid attention to the details most people skipped. I took the kind of long view that doesn't produce immediate applause, but sometimes creates opportunities months or even years later. One of those opportunities became the biggest deal I'd ever worked on. It took months to arrange, dozens of conversations, careful timing, the kind of negotiation that requires patience more than pressure. Everything was finally ready. The client had agreed to a meeting. The numbers made sense. Internally, it could have changed the trajectory of our department for the next 2 years. Then one afternoon, my manager called me into his office. He told me to cancel the meeting. Just like that. He said the deal wasn't important anymore. No explanation, no discussion, just a decision. At the time, it sounded like another routine corporate moment, one of those strange executive calls that employees learn not to question too loudly. But when the client heard the news, their reaction created a much bigger problem than anyone in that office expected. And strangely enough, that moment didn't start with anger or confrontation or even resistance. It started with silence. The kind of silence people often mistake for agreement. What most of them didn't realize was that silence can also mean something else entirely. It can mean someone is paying attention. It can mean someone is remembering everything. And sometimes it means someone is quietly deciding what to do next. Before I tell you what happened after that meeting was cancelled, there's something important you need to understand first. Who I was, in their eyes. Because the version of me they believed in was the reason none of them saw what was coming. But before we go into the story, let me introduce the person behind it. In our office, people like to categorize each other quickly. It made things easier. You had the loud strategists who loved whiteboards and long explanations, the ambitious climbers who scheduled meetings just to be seen in them, the charismatic closers who dominated conference calls and filled rooms with energy. And then there were people like me, reliable, quiet, consistent, the kind of employee managers trusted with important tasks, but rarely talked about when discussing leadership potential. I didn't resent that role. In fact, for a long time, I accepted it almost naturally. Every team has someone who keeps things moving without drawing attention to themselves. Someone who makes sure the details don't fall apart while everyone else focuses on bigger narratives. That person was usually me. If a project needed long-term coordination, I handled it. If a client required patience and steady communication, I became the point of contact. If something complicated needed to be organized across several departments, it eventually landed on my desk. People didn't question that arrangement. They just assumed it was where I belonged. My manager at the time, Daniel, was the kind of leader who appreciated visible results more than quiet processes. He liked confident presentations, bold projections, and decisive statements in meetings. I respected him in many ways, but I also understood something about how he saw people. In his mental map of the office, there were 2 types of employees: the ones who drove momentum and the ones who supported it. I was firmly placed in the second category. That wasn't said out loud, of course. It never is. Instead, it showed up in small patterns. In meetings, when I explained the progress of a client relationship I'd been developing for months, Daniel would nod politely, but then shift the conversation to someone else's more dramatic initiative. When a deal required patience instead of urgency, it would quietly become Victor's project. And when something actually worked, it usually blended into the background of the department's overall success. None of this felt cruel. It was just invisible. And invisibility has a strange effect over time. People stop thinking of you as someone whose work could change the direction of things. They begin to see you as part of the structure instead, stable, useful, predictable. Which is exactly how they saw me during the months I spent building one particular client relationship. A relationship that required more patience than most people in our office were willing to give. It took careful timing, long conversations, and a willingness to listen more than talk. Most of my colleagues barely noticed it happening. To them, it probably looked like just another quiet assignment Victor was handling in the background, but to me, it was something else entirely. It was the kind of opportunity that could quietly reshape an entire department's future. And eventually, it led to the meeting that my manager would later tell me to cancel. But before that moment arrived, there was a smaller moment first. A moment most people in the room probably forgot within minutes. I didn't, because sometimes the first sign of how people truly see you appears in the smallest possible gesture. The first moment was so small that, if you had been sitting in the meeting with us, you probably wouldn't have noticed it. It happened on a Tuesday morning during our weekly department review. Everyone was gathered around the long conference table, laptops open, coffee cups scattered between notebooks, the usual quiet tapping of keyboards while Daniel walked us through the agenda. About halfway through the meeting, he paused and looked in my direction. "Victor," he said, glancing briefly at his tablet. "How's that manufacturing client progressing? The one you've been talking to for a while?" It wasn't the most precise description, but I knew which client he meant. I explained the situation calmly. The company had been hesitant at first, but over the past few months, the relationship had slowly developed. We had exchanged several proposals. Their leadership team was reviewing a long-term consulting agreement. And more importantly, they had finally agreed to meet. Not just a casual conversation, but a formal strategy session. The kind that usually happens only when both sides are seriously considering moving forward. It had taken patience to get there. When I finished explaining, there was a brief pause in the room. One or two people nodded. Someone typed something quickly on their laptop. Then Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said with a small shrug, "let's not get too excited yet. These slow-burn deals rarely close the way people expect." The room moved on almost immediately. Another colleague started presenting an aggressive expansion proposal. The energy shifted. Voices grew louder. The conversation left my update behind, as it had never happened. No one was being cruel. Daniel wasn't insulting me. He wasn't dismissing the work outright. But in that small moment, something subtle had been communicated. The months of careful conversations, the progress that had taken time to build, had been quietly minimized. Not attacked, just reduced. I remember sitting there listening to the rest of the meeting while the familiar office rhythm continued around me. Whiteboard markers squeaking, chairs shifting, someone laughing at a joke about quarterly projections. And while all of that continued, I wrote one small line in my notebook, just a date, and a short note about the meeting. I've always had the habit of documenting things, not out of suspicion, but out of discipline. Conversations blur over time. Details fade. Writing them down keeps them honest. At the time, I didn't feel angry. If anything, I told myself, Daniel probably just didn't understand how much groundwork had gone into the relationship. From his perspective, it probably looked like just another uncertain lead. So I did what I usually did. I stayed quiet. I continued the work. And over the next several weeks, the relationship with that client kept growing stronger. Phone calls became longer. Emails turned into detailed planning discussions. Eventually, they asked if we could schedule an in-person strategy meeting. The kind of meeting that only happens when a company is seriously considering committing to something large. When that email arrived, I remember reading it twice. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew what it represented. Months of quiet effort have finally reached a turning point. What I didn't realize yet was that the small moment in that Tuesday meeting wasn't isolated. It was the beginning of a pattern that would slowly teach me something important about the role people had already assigned to me in that office. And once you understand the role others expect you to play, you begin to notice how often they reinforce it. After that Tuesday meeting, nothing dramatic changed. That was the strange part. There were no arguments, no confrontations, no moments where anyone openly dismissed my work. Instead, things continued exactly the way they always had, which is how subtle patterns become normal. Over the next few weeks, the client relationship kept progressing. We exchanged more documents, discussed timelines, and slowly built the kind of trust that rarely appears in fast-moving negotiations. It was steady work, quiet work, the kind that doesn't produce exciting updates every day, but moves forward little by little. When I occasionally mentioned the progress during team check-ins, the reaction was always polite but brief. Daniel would nod, sometimes ask one or two surface-level questions, and then shift the meeting towards something more energetic. A new marketing initiative, a potential partnership someone had just discovered, an expansion idea that sounded impressive but hadn't been tested yet. Those conversations always filled the room with more enthusiasm. Mine usually passed through it like background noise. At first, I told myself this was completely reasonable. After all, the deal I was working on was slow, careful. It required patience rather than excitement. Not every opportunity needs attention in its early stages. That's what I told myself. And honestly, that explanation worked for a while. But small moments kept repeating. One afternoon, a colleague stopped by my desk and asked what I'd been working on lately. I mentioned the same client and explained that we were preparing for a formal strategy meeting. He nodded politely. Then he said something I don't think he meant as criticism. "Ah, right, your long-term projects." He smiled when he said it, like it was a friendly joke. And maybe it was. But the phrase stayed with me longer than the conversation itself. Your long-term projects. The wording made something clear. To them, the work I did existed in a different category. Not urgent, not visible. Just ongoing. Something stable in the background. Even Daniel started referring to it that way. During one meeting, he said almost casually, "Victor handles the relationship maintenance deals." Maintenance. It was an interesting word. Maintenance implies something already stable, something predictable, something that doesn't require strategic attention. But that's not what I had been doing. I had been building something from the ground up. Yet the label stuck. And once a label sticks in a workplace, people rarely question it. Eventually, I noticed something else. When others talked about opportunities, they described them with energy. But when people mentioned my work, the tone was different, calmer, more routine. It wasn't disrespect in the obvious sense. No one raised their voice. No one belittled me. Instead, my work had simply been placed in a box. Reliable, safe, low drama. And over time, I realized something important. When people believe they understand your role, they stop looking closely at what you're actually doing. At the time, I didn't push back. I didn't try to correct the narrative. I just continued showing up to work, having conversations with the client, documenting every step, and preparing for the strategy meeting we had scheduled. Looking back, that might seem like passivity. But the truth is, I hadn't fully understood the situation yet. Not until another realization arrived. A quieter one. The moment I finally understood the role everyone in that office believed I was supposed to play. The realization didn't come from a dramatic moment. No one said anything openly disrespectful. No confrontation forced the truth into the room. Instead, it arrived gradually. Through observation. Once you start paying attention to patterns in a workplace, certain things become difficult to ignore. For example, who gets asked for opinions when decisions are made? Who gets invited into conversations before meetings even begin? And who gets informed about decisions only after they've already been made? Over time, I noticed where I usually appeared in that sequence. Near the end, not excluded exactly, just late to the conversation. It happened one afternoon when I walked past Daniel's office and noticed a small group gathered inside. 2 senior colleagues were discussing a new initiative, something about expanding into another sector. Their voices were animated, the kind of conversation people have when they believe they're shaping something important. Later that day, during the department update meeting, Daniel summarized the idea for the rest of us. Some of us were discussing a potential expansion earlier, he said casually. Then he briefly explained the plan. I listened, along with everyone else, as if it were the first time I was hearing about it. Which, for me, it was. Again, this wasn't unusual in itself. But once I started noticing the pattern, it appeared everywhere. Some people were included early. Others were included later, and a few, like me, were usually included once things were already decided. The role became clearer. I wasn't there to shape direction. I was there to execute reliably once direction had been chosen. In many organizations, that's not a negative role. In fact, it's often essential. But something about the way it had formed around me felt incomplete. Because while the office saw me as someone who handled stable, predictable work, my actual projects often required careful strategy, especially the client relationship I had been developing. That project had involved months of judgment calls: when to push forward, when to slow down, when to let the other side feel comfortable before discussing numbers. None of that had been routine, yet in the office narrative, it had quietly become exactly that, just another long-term maintenance project Victor was handling. And once people settle on a narrative like that, they rarely question it. Daniel certainly didn't. To him, I was dependable, low maintenance, the kind of employee who would quietly handle complex things without creating noise around them. In many ways, that perception worked in my favor. It gave me freedom. No one micromanaged my conversations with the client. No one asked for constant progress reports. They trusted the process, mostly because they didn't think it required much attention. But understanding the role people assign to you can be strangely clarifying. Once you see it, you realize something important. People rarely see the full picture of who you are. They see the version that fits comfortably into their system. Reliable, useful, invisible. For a long time, I had accepted that version without thinking much about it. It made work peaceful, predictable. But somewhere during those months, as the client relationship quietly grew stronger, I started to realize something. If everyone around me believed I was simply maintaining something, then none of them were actually watching what I was building. And that kind of invisibility can do two very different things to a person. It can slowly wear them down, or it can give them space. At the time, I hadn't decided which one it would be for me. But that decision began forming on a day that, at first, seemed completely ordinary. A quiet moment, a small shift, the kind of moment that doesn't look important while it's happening. But later, you realize it changed everything. The moment didn't happen during a meeting. There was no confrontation, no sharp comment, no obvious turning point that everyone in the room would remember later. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening, long after most of the office had gone home. I was still at my desk reviewing a draft proposal for the client I'd been working with for months. Their leadership team had asked for a detailed outline before confirming the strategy meeting we were planning. The office was almost silent, just the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sound of an elevator opening somewhere down the hallway. I remember leaning back in my chair for a moment, reading through the proposal again, making small notes in my notebook. That notebook had been with me for years. Every meeting, every conversation, every promise someone made in passing, it all went in there. Not because I expected to use it against anyone, but because memory is unreliable. Documentation isn't. As I reviewed the timeline of the relationship with this client, I noticed something that made me pause. Nearly every meaningful step in the process had happened quietly. No one had pushed me to pursue the opportunity. No one had guided the strategy. And aside from occasional brief updates, no one had really followed its progress either. For months, I had been building something substantial, almost entirely outside the attention of the office. At first, that realization felt slightly uncomfortable. Most people want their work to be seen, recognized, validated. But as I sat there looking at the notes in front of me, another thought slowly replaced that feeling. If no one was watching closely, then no one was interfering either. The relationship had grown on its own rhythm. Patient conversations, careful timing. Small moments of trust are built over time. No pressure from management, no sudden changes in direction, just steady progress. And for the first time, I realized something important about the way my role in the office worked. My invisibility wasn't just a limitation, it was also protection. Because the people who might have rushed the process or pushed for quick results had barely been paying attention. They assumed it was just another slow project, another quiet assignment Victor was handling in the background, which meant they had left it alone. I closed my notebook and looked around the empty office. The glass walls of the conference rooms reflected the city lights outside. Desks sat dark and silent, the energy of the day already gone. For a long moment, I just sat there thinking. Not about proving anyone wrong. Not about confronting Daniel. Just about clarity. The clarity that comes when you finally understand the system you're working in. People saw me a certain way. Reliable, quiet, predictable. And that perception wasn't going to change overnight. But it didn't necessarily have to. Because sometimes the most useful position in a system is the one people underestimate. That night, something inside me shifted. Not emotionally, strategically. I stopped thinking about how others viewed my work and started focusing entirely on the work itself. No need to explain it. No need to advertise it. Just continue building, quietly. What I didn't know yet was that very soon, the entire office would suddenly start paying attention to the project they had mostly ignored. But not because of success. Because of a decision my manager would make. A decision that at the time, he probably thought was completely routine. And when that moment arrived, my silence would stop being accidental. It would become a choice. After that evening in the office, nothing about my behavior changed in ways that other people could easily see. I still attended the same meetings, still gave the same calm updates, still listened more than I spoke. From the outside, I probably looked exactly the same as before. But internally, something had shifted. Before that moment, my quietness had mostly been a personality trait, a natural way of moving through the workplace without competing for attention. Now it has become something more deliberate, a choice. Because once you understand how people perceive you, you also understand how little effort they make to reevaluate that perception. Most people decide who you are early on. After that, they stop looking closely. And that's exactly what continued happening in our office. Weeks passed, and the project with the client kept progressing. Their leadership team reviewed the proposal carefully. We scheduled longer calls to walk through specific details. Eventually, they suggested meeting in person to finalize the direction of the partnership. It wasn't a small opportunity. The scale of the contract we were discussing could influence our department's performance for the next couple of years. But inside the office, the reaction remained mostly unchanged. During meetings, Daniel would ask for a brief update. I'd summarize the progress calmly. He'd nod. Then the conversation would move on to something louder, usually a new idea someone had just brought into the room. At some point, I realized something interesting about those meetings. When people talk about things they believe are important, they ask a lot of questions. They lean forward. They challenge details. But when I spoke about the client relationship, most people simply accepted the update and continued with the agenda. It wasn't hostility. It was an assumption. In their minds, the project already belonged to a category, Victor's steady background work. And once a project sits in that category, it rarely receives close attention. I stopped trying to change that perception. Not because I had given up, but because I had started to understand the advantage of it. Silence creates space. Space allows you to observe things others miss. For example, I noticed how quickly priorities shifted inside the department. One week, everyone would be excited about a new market opportunity. The next week, the same idea would quietly disappear from conversation. People chased momentum. They moved toward whatever felt urgent. Meanwhile, the work I was doing continued quietly, step by step, unaffected by those shifts. Every call with the client strengthened the relationship. Every document we exchanged clarified expectations. And every detail went into my notebook. Dates, promises, agreements about the upcoming strategy meeting. I wrote everything down the same way I always had, not because I expected conflict, just because careful records create clarity. Looking back, I think that's when my silence stopped being mistaken for uncertainty. It became something else entirely. Focus. The client and I had finally settled on a date for the meeting that would bring everything together. Their leadership team would visit our office. We would spend several hours reviewing the proposal, adjusting details, and, if everything aligned, moving toward a formal agreement. Months of work had led to that moment, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think about what it might mean. No recognition, not validation, just completion. But while I was quietly preparing for that meeting, something else was happening inside the office. Something subtle, something almost no one else seemed to notice. Because while people assumed they understood the role I played in the system, there were details they had never actually looked at. Details about the work itself, about the relationship with the client, about how much trust had quietly been built over those months. Things that seemed small individually, but together, they formed something far more significant than anyone in that office realized. And the strange part was this: the more invisible my work appeared, the more carefully I started paying attention to everything around it. By the time the strategy meeting with the client was scheduled, nearly 6 months had passed since my first conversation with them. 6 months of small, consistent steps. Most of those steps had happened quietly. Emails, calls, drafts, revisions, pauses when necessary, patience when the timing wasn't right. From the outside, it probably looked slow. But that's the nature of relationships that actually matter in business. They grow gradually, not dramatically. Inside the office, almost no one tracked those details, which meant almost no one noticed the patterns forming around the project. For example, they didn't see how the client's tone had changed over time. In the beginning, their emails had been cautious, short responses, careful wording, the kind of communication companies use when they're still evaluating whether someone is trustworthy. But over the months, that tone softened. Messages became longer. Calls became less formal. At some point, they stopped addressing me as Mr. Hale and simply started calling me Victor. That kind of shift doesn't happen because of a good proposal. It happens because trust is slowly being built. Another thing no one in the office seemed to notice was how deeply involved the client's leadership team had become in our conversations. Initially, I had been speaking mostly with a mid-level operations director, but gradually, other names started appearing in emails. The CFO joined one of our calls. Later, their CEO attended part of a discussion about long-term strategy. That kind of involvement usually signals something important. The decision is moving higher inside the organization. Again, none of this produced excitement inside our office, because none of it looked dramatic. But in my notebook, the timeline told a very clear story. Date by date, conversation by conversation, the relationship had grown stronger. Every commitment was written down. Every agreement about the upcoming meeting is carefully documented. The meeting itself was no longer tentative. It was confirmed. Flights had been booked. An agenda had been prepared. Rooms in our office had been reserved for the discussion. By that point, the potential value of the partnership had also become clearer. If the agreement moved forward, it would easily become one of the most significant contracts our department had handled in years. Not impossible to achieve, but rare. Still, in the office, the project remained strangely quiet. People were busy with other initiatives. Some of those initiatives were exciting, some were risky. A few disappeared almost as quickly as they had been proposed. Meanwhile, the client relationship continued progressing calmly toward the scheduled meeting. Looking back now, I realized something interesting about that period. The more progress the project made, it seemed to become less visible inside the office. It had settled so deeply into the category of Victor's background work that no one thought to reevaluate it. Even Daniel. He occasionally asked whether the meeting was still scheduled. I'd confirm the date. He'd nod and move on. There was never a long discussion about the scale of the opportunity. No detailed strategic review, just a quiet acknowledgement that something was happening. And because of that, I kept doing what I had been doing since the beginning. Preparing carefully, reviewing every detail, making sure the upcoming meeting would run smoothly. I printed copies of the proposal, refined the agenda, double-checked the timeline for the discussion. Everything was ready. What none of us realized at that moment was how fragile that preparation actually was. Because sometimes in an organization, decisions aren't made based on careful work. Sometimes they're made quickly, casually, without fully understanding what they affect. And a few days before the meeting was supposed to happen, I would walk into Daniel's office and hear a sentence that at the time sounded almost routine. "Victor, go ahead and cancel that meeting with the client." He said it like it was a small adjustment, a simple scheduling change. But when the client received the message, their reaction would turn that small decision into something much bigger. A few days before the meeting, something happened that made me review the entire project again. It wasn't dramatic. Just an email. The client's CFO sent me a message late in the evening after one of our preparation calls. Most of it was routine, confirming travel plans, asking about the structure of the strategy session, making sure the time blocks made sense. But at the end of the message, there was a short sentence that made me pause. He wrote, "Victor, we appreciate the way you've handled this process. It's rare to work with someone who understands how much trust matters before numbers." I read that line twice, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had sensed for months. The relationship wasn't just professional anymore. It was personal trust. In business, that difference matters more than most people realize. Companies sign contracts with organizations, but leaders decide those contracts based on people. And over time, I had become the person they trusted on our side. That realization created a kind of quiet clarity. Not excitement, just understanding. Because it meant the upcoming meeting wasn't simply about reviewing numbers or adjusting terms. It was about confirming something that had already been building beneath the surface. Confidence. The next morning, I arrived at the office a little earlier than usual and reviewed my notes again. The notebook in front of me had nearly 6 months of documentation. Every call, every shift in tone, every agreement about how the partnership might move forward. If someone had looked at those pages without context, it might have seemed excessive. But reading through them that morning revealed something important. The project had momentum, not the loud kind of people who celebrate in meetings, the quiet kind that forms when both sides begin trusting the process. I also noticed another detail. Almost every critical conversation had been between the client and me directly, not with Daniel, not with other people in the department. Me. That wasn't intentional at first. It had just happened naturally as the relationship developed. But now, looking at it clearly, I understand the implication. If the meeting went well, the trust they had built wasn't attached to the company alone. It was attached to the person they had been working with. And that realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because trust like that has weight. It means people are expecting honesty, stability, and follow-through. Things that can't easily be transferred from one person to another. That morning, I wrote one more note in my notebook, not about the numbers, not about the proposal, just a quiet observation about the situation itself. Trust is already built. I closed the notebook and set it back on my desk. The meeting was only a few days away. Everything was prepared. All that remained was to host the conversation and move forward. But later that afternoon, Daniel asked me to step into his office. He didn't look concerned. He didn't seem frustrated. In fact, he spoke the way managers often do when making what they believe is a simple adjustment. "Victor," he said casually, "go ahead and cancel that meeting with the client. No explanation, no discussion, just a decision." At first I thought I might have misunderstood, but he continued speaking, almost dismissively. "The deal isn't that important anymore." I remember sitting there quietly for a moment, not arguing, not reacting, just absorbing the sentence. Because in that moment, something became very clear to me. Daniel wasn't seeing the situation the same way the client and I were, and once I realized that, I understood something else too. The moment I sent that cancellation email, the reaction from the client wouldn't be small. It would be immediate, and it would reveal something about this project that no one in the office had fully understood yet. When Daniel told me to cancel the meeting, the room became very quiet, not externally. His office still had the same background noise of phones ringing somewhere down the hallway and muffled conversations drifting through the glass walls. But internally, everything slowed down, because in moments like that, you realize you're standing at a decision point. And most of the time, no one else in the room even knows it exists. Daniel leaned back in his chair while he spoke, scrolling through something on his tablet as if the topic required very little attention. "The timing doesn't make sense right now," he added. "We're shifting focus to some other opportunities." He said it the way executives often do when they believe they're simplifying something. But what struck me wasn't the instruction itself. It was how casually the months behind it had been dismissed. 6 months of conversations. 6 months of trust building. 6 months of preparation that had already moved beyond simple interest, reduced to a quick scheduling change. I didn't argue. There are moments when pushing back emotionally only creates noise. Instead, I asked a calm question. Should I explain the reason to them? Daniel shrugged slightly. "Just say we're re-evaluating priorities. Happens all the time." To him, it probably did. Clients cancel meetings. Companies change direction. Deals fall apart. From his perspective, this was routine, but I knew something he didn't. This wasn't a cold lead. This wasn't an early-stage conversation. This was a relationship that had moved well past the point where sudden cancellations feel normal, especially after flights had been booked. Especially after the CEO had cleared time in their schedule. I left his office with the same calm expression I had walked in with. Back at my desk, I opened my notebook again. The last few pages were filled with preparation notes for the upcoming meeting. Agenda points, key discussion topics, questions the client's leadership team had asked during the previous call. For a moment, I simply looked at those pages. Then I closed the notebook slowly. The instruction itself wasn't complicated. Cancel the meeting. But the real decision wasn't about sending the email. The real decision was about how to handle the consequences that would follow. Because I knew there would be consequences. Not dramatic ones. Not angry phone calls or emotional reactions. But something more subtle and often more serious in business. Confusion. When trust has been built carefully over months, sudden changes create questions. Questions that rarely stay contained. The client's leadership team would want to understand what had happened. Why the meeting they had committed to no longer mattered. Why was the process they had invested time in suddenly being paused? And more importantly, who had made that decision? I could already imagine the conversation that would follow once they received the message. The CFO is reviewing the email. The CEO asked what had changed. Someone inevitably asks the simplest question of all. What happened on their side? I sat there quietly for a few minutes, thinking through the situation. Not emotionally, just strategically. Daniel had made a decision. My responsibility was to execute it. But how that execution happened still required care. So I opened my email. I began drafting the message. Clear, professional, honest, without adding interpretation. Just the information Daniel had instructed me to deliver. Once it was finished, I read it twice before sending it. Then I clicked send. The message left my outbox quietly. No dramatic moment, no visible reaction in the office around me. Most people were still working on their own projects, unaware that anything significant had just happened. But somewhere else, in another office across the country, a group of executives would soon read that email. And once they did, something inside our company would begin shifting, slowly at first, then all at once. After I sent the email, nothing in the office changed, at least not immediately. The same conversations continued around me. Keyboards clicked. Someone laughed near the break room. A meeting invitation appeared on my calendar for the following afternoon. From the outside, it looked like just another ordinary workday, which is often how important moments begin, quietly. I didn't announce the cancellation to anyone. Daniel hadn't asked for an update, and no one else had been closely following the meeting preparations anyway, so I simply returned to the rest of my work. But internally, my attention sharpened, because when a decision like that is made, especially one that interrupts months of relationship building, there's always a delay before the consequences appear. The client needed time to read the message, time to process it, time to decide how they wanted to respond. That delay gave me something useful: space. Not space to interfere or to change the decision that had already been made, but space to prepare for the questions that might come. I opened my notebook again. The habit of documenting things had always been a simple discipline for me. Now it has become something slightly more deliberate. I reviewed the timeline of the entire relationship, our first conversation, the early exploratory calls, the moment when their operations director had introduced their CFO into the discussions, the agreement to hold an in-person strategy meeting. Every step had a date. Every step had context. If anyone ever asked what had happened with this client relationship, the record would be clear. No interpretations, just facts. I also reviewed the preparation materials we had built for the meeting. The strategy outline, the financial projections, the draft framework for the potential partnership. None of that work had disappeared simply because the meeting had been cancelled. It still existed. Months of effort, sitting quietly in digital folders and printed documents. While I was reviewing those materials, an interesting thought crossed my mind. Most people in the office probably believed that cancelling the meeting meant the opportunity had simply ended. That's how these situations are usually perceived internally. But relationships between companies don't disappear that easily, especially when trust has been built directly between individuals. Even if the meeting was cancelled, the relationship still existed, which meant the client's reaction would matter. Not emotionally, strategically. How they interpreted the cancellation would determine what happened next. Would they simply move on? Would they ask questions? Or would they try to understand why something that had been carefully prepared for months had suddenly been dismissed? I didn't know yet, and that uncertainty was exactly why silence remained the best approach. So I continued working, attended meetings, answered emails, participated in the usual office routines as if nothing unusual had happened. Because in a situation like this, drawing attention to the moment rarely helps. What matters is observation, watching how people respond once the information begins to move through the system. And sure enough, later that evening, just as I was finishing the last email of the day, my phone buzzed quietly on the desk. A message notification from the client's CFO. It was short, just one sentence. "Victor, we just saw your email. Can we speak tomorrow morning?" I read the message once, then again. There was no anger in the wording, no accusation, just a simple request for clarity. But something about that request told me the situation was no longer contained. Because when executives ask for a direct conversation like that, it usually means the questions behind it are much bigger than a cancelled meeting. And once those questions started being asked, people in my office would finally begin to notice the project they had mostly ignored. The call happened the next morning, earlier than most of the office had even arrived. I stepped into one of the smaller conference rooms, closed the glass door, and returned the CFO's call. He answered almost immediately. His voice was calm, professional, the same tone he had used during our previous discussions. But there was something different underneath it. Focus. "Victor," he said, "we received your email last night. I wanted to understand what changed." The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. Because this wasn't someone casually asking about a scheduling conflict. This was someone whose company had already committed leadership time, flights, and internal preparation for a meeting they believed was moving toward a real partnership. I answered the only way I could, carefully. "Our leadership team is re-evaluating priorities right now," I said. The instruction I received was to pause the meeting. There was a short silence on the other end of the line. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Then he asked the question I had expected. "Was there an issue with the proposal?" "No," I replied honestly. Nothing changed in the proposal itself. Another pause. Then I heard the faint sound of someone else speaking quietly near him, probably another executive in the room. When he returned to the call, his tone had shifted slightly, still calm, but more serious. "Victor," he said, "our CEO cleared his calendar for that meeting. We've spent several weeks preparing our internal team. I just want to make sure we're understanding this correctly." It was a fair question. And again, the only responsible answer was clarity. "As far as I understand," I said, "the decision came from our management side." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked something different. "Were you involved in that decision?" "No," I said simply. Another brief silence followed. Then his voice softened slightly. "Well," he said, "that's, unfortunate." He didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed. And disappointment in business relationships can sometimes carry more weight than frustration. Before we ended the call, he said something that stayed with me. "We've appreciated the way you've handled this process, Victor. If anything changes on your side, we'd be open to continuing the conversation." It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't pressure. Just a quiet statement of fact. We ended the call politely. I returned to my desk a few minutes later and opened my notebook again. Date, time of the call, key points from the conversation. I wrote them down the same way I had documented every other step in the relationship. But while I was finishing that note, something else began happening in the office. Not suddenly, gradually. Later that morning, Daniel walked past my desk and stopped. "Did the client respond?" he asked casually. "They asked for clarification," I said. He nodded. "That's normal." Then he continued walking. But by the afternoon, something else had begun spreading through the department. Questions. Someone in finance had apparently heard that the client's CFO had called our office earlier. Someone else had noticed that travel arrangements connected to the meeting had suddenly been cancelled. Little fragments of information, nothing dramatic, but enough to make people curious. Because when executives from another company start asking questions directly, people tend to notice. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the office began realizing something they hadn't paid attention to before. The background project Victor had been quietly working on for months wasn't small. And once people started understanding that, the consequences of cancelling that meeting would become much harder to ignore. By the next day, the atmosphere in the office had subtly changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. At first, the shift appeared through small questions. Someone from finance stopped by my desk and asked whether the strategy meeting with the manufacturing client had been postponed. Another colleague mentioned hearing that their CFO had contacted our office directly. The information was incomplete, moving through the department in fragments. But fragments were enough to spark curiosity, because the more people asked about the situation, the clearer something became. Many of them hadn't realized how advanced the discussions with that client actually were. For months, the project had existed quietly in the background. Now people were beginning to see the scale of it. Later that afternoon, Daniel asked me to step into his office again. This time his tone was slightly different, less casual. "So, the client seemed concerned?" he asked. "They were surprised," I said calmly. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. I didn't realize they were that invested already. I didn't respond immediately, not because I wanted to make a point, just because the situation had already explained itself. The preparation, the flights. The CEO is clearing his calendar. Those were all signals that the relationship had moved beyond early-stage conversations. Daniel rubbed his forehead briefly. "Maybe we should reschedule the meeting," he said after a moment. The suggestion sounded simple, but something about it felt late. Because in business relationships, timing carries meaning. Cancelling a carefully arranged meeting signals uncertainty. Trying to restore it immediately afterwards signals something else. Hesitation. I explained the situation carefully. "They're open to continuing the conversation," I said, "but they'll probably need clarity about why the meeting was cancelled." Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time, it seemed like he was fully realizing the position we were in. What had looked like a small internal adjustment had already travelled outside the company. And once trust begins to shift, it's difficult to rewind the moment that caused it. Not impossible, but never simple. That afternoon, the office felt quieter than usual, not tense, just thoughtful. People were beginning to understand something that had gone mostly unnoticed for months. The relationship with that client had been much more significant than anyone realized. And now, even if the company tried to repair the situation, the original moment had already passed. The next morning, Daniel asked me to come into his office again. This time the tone was different, not urgent, not angry, just more careful. He closed the door behind me and sat down at the desk. "I've been thinking about that client situation," he said. "Maybe we should try to reopen the conversation." I nodded slightly. "They said they'd be open to continuing," I replied, "but they'll probably want to understand what changed." Daniel leaned back in his chair, quiet for a moment. Then he asked something more directly. "How far along were things, really?" It wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like someone realizing they might have misread the situation. So I answered plainly. "The CEO had cleared time for the meeting," I said. "Their CFO and operations team were preparing internal numbers." I paused briefly before adding the last part. They were expecting to move forward if the strategy session went well. Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened. For the first time since the project had started, it felt like he was seeing the full picture of what had been built over those months. Not the simplified version, the real one. After a moment, he exhaled slowly. "I didn't realize it had reached that stage." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to add. He rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. "If we reach back out and explain things, do you think they'll still trust the process?" It was an honest question, and honesty deserved the same in return. "I think they still trust the relationship," I said. "But moments like that, they change how people evaluate reliability." Daniel nodded slowly. There was no argument, no raised voices, just quiet understanding. Because sometimes the most significant confrontations don't involve conflict at all. They happen when two people finally see the same situation clearly. And once that clarity arrives, there's usually only one realization left. Some decisions can be reconsidered, but the moment when they first happened can't be taken back. A few weeks passed after that conversation. The situation with the client didn't explode into drama. There were no angry emails, no public fallout, no dramatic consequences that everyone in the office could point to. Instead, the outcome was quieter than that. The relationship simply changed. The client remained polite and professional, but the momentum we had built over those 6 months never fully returned. Conversations became more cautious, timelines stretched out. Eventually, the opportunity faded into something smaller than it could have been. No one blamed anyone directly. But the lesson stayed with me, not as frustration, as clarity. For a long time in my career, I had believed that being quiet meant staying out of the center of things. Doing good work in the background was enough for people to eventually understand its value. What I learned from that experience was slightly different. Being quiet isn't a weakness, but being invisible can allow important work to be misunderstood. Since then, I haven't changed who I am. I'm still calm in meetings, still more comfortable listening than speaking. Still, someone who prefers careful preparation over dramatic announcements. But I also learned something about timing, about when silence helps, and when clarity needs to appear sooner. Because sometimes the work you're doing quietly carries more weight than others realize. And if people don't see that weight at the right moment, decisions get made without the full picture. I don't hold resentment toward Daniel. He made the decision he believed was reasonable at the time. But that experience changed how I think about responsibility, not just for doing the work, but for making sure the work is understood when it matters. These days, when I build something slowly, I also make sure the right people see it clearly before the critical moment arrives. Not louder, just clearer. When I look back on that situation now, I don't see it as a story about a bad manager or a lost deal. Those things happen in business all the time. What stayed with me was something quieter. How easily people can misread work that happens without noise. For months, the relationship with that client had grown steadily. Trust had been built through patience, attention, and consistency. But because the process didn't look dramatic from the outside, most people assumed it wasn't that significant, and when the moment came to make a decision about it, the full picture simply wasn't there. That experience changed the way I think about quiet work. Silence can be powerful. It allows you to focus, to observe, to build things carefully without constant interference. But silence also has limits. If the right people don't understand what's being built before an important decision is made, even the strongest work can be interrupted by a single casual choice. These days, I still believe in patience. I still believe that trust grows slowly and that good work doesn't always need attention every step of the way. But I also believe something else now. Sometimes, quiet strength isn't just about doing the work well. It's about making sure the value of that work becomes visible at the moment it matters most. That's the balance I learned from this experience. And I'm curious what you think. Have you ever spent months building something important, only to see someone dismiss it because they didn't realize how much work was behind it?